independent sacramental movement. I have my own small, very small church called the Open Rite. I have been involved in the esoteric and the occult for probably well over 20 years at this point. Actually, probably going now, approaching 25 years. So I'm active in my community. I've done quite a bit of online work with folks. I was one of the people who helped kind of build the online esoteric community. And I'm involved with a number of projects, including a small Gnostic church here in Chicago. I'm also a student of the teachings of G.I. Gurdjieff. And I have an active candle ministry as well. That's something that's been a real focus of my practice over the past year, is that I take requests for folks who need lights set for them, and I set them here in my home, and I live stream the setting on Facebook. I call it Candle Cam, as a matter of fact, and people can check in. Usually a few times a week I do this, but that's really been a very positive ministry for me over the past year, is doing these candle settings for people. So that gives you kind of a snapshot of what I am and who I am and what I do.
Nice. So I had a question just to start off. Could you define, like, what is the Gnostic tradition for people who don't know?
What people need to understand is the term Gnostic gets used a lot in a lot of different ways. The upshot of it is that when early Christianity was forming, there were multiple ideas about what Christianity was about. There were multiple churches, and there were some churches that were eventually identified or called Gnostic churches, usually by so-called heresiologists, or the various Orthodox bishops who were investigating a supposed heresy in the church. So there were a number of groups who there were definite differences between them, but there was, generally speaking, a distrust of the material world, and the idea that that there is a demented demiurge God who has proclaimed himself to be the supreme ruler of the universe, when in fact there is actually a hidden God or an unknown God beyond that God. And there are some fairly elaborate mythologies that discuss how this happens, that people are worshiping. The idea is that people are worshiping this demiurge or this demented tyrant God and not the true God. And you had various sects and churches that arose that wanted to counteract that human tendency to fight the archons or the rulers that bind people, and instead, through a system of spiritual practices, one could obtain gnosis, or knowledge or insight into the nature of the true God, the nature of oneself, and the nature of spiritual powers. So these churches were pretty much eliminated fairly early on. I mean, they were around, they flourished for a while, then they went away. But at various times throughout history, you've seen churches that have arisen, churches and groups that have arisen, arguing who perhaps borrowed some ideas or had some similar ideas to the early Gnostics. What eventually happened, of course, was in mid-20th century was the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library, which was a collection of codexes, or kind of proto-books, that included many of the scriptures and teachings from these various so-called Gnostic sects. And that was a revelation, because there was very little literature that had survived from that period. But all of a sudden there was this fairly decent collection, this library of literature that eventually was discovered by accident, got into the hands of academics, and was eventually translated. So there's been a real revival in Gnostic studies. But there has also been an interest in Gnostic spirituality. So there are churches in the so-called French Gnostic line that descend from some folks who were operating in France back in the 1800s, who eventually got apostolic succession. But there are also Gnostic churches today that don't claim not apostolic succession and don't have really any interest in that, but they do practice their own form of Gnostic spirituality. So that's kind of it in a somewhat long nutshell.
Very, very large nutshell.
I've studied,
yeah,
I mean, being at least a history buff, I've studied a little bit of the Gnostic movement, and it's like, yeah, that's pretty straight on. Correct me if I'm wrong, but at least some of the documents we're talking about are also the so-called lost gospels, aren't they?
Yeah, that was something, I think that was, in my opinion, more of a marketing term. You know, we talked about the Lost Gospels or the Gnostic Bible. The Nag Hammadi, when it was published, was sold as the Gnostic Bible. Well, you know, it was a collection of writings from different groups. It was not, they didn't have one single Bible. Neither did the Christian Church for quite some time. Meaning the Orthodox, or, you know, smaller Orthodox Christian Church. So yeah, you had these things were sometimes marketed as the Lost Gospels or the Gnostic Gospels or the Hidden Gospels or Secret Gospels. The interesting thing, though, is that when people would try to read these books and they're thinking, oh, yeah, we're getting some great secrets, they end up reading something that, you know, is just completely very difficult to read in some cases extremely fanciful, in other cases very profound. But people who would just open up the Nag Hammadi books and start reading them and think that they're going to have all the secrets to the universe usually have another thing coming, because these books, these texts arose out of communities, and in communities that often practiced kind of an oral tradition of mouth to ear between initiator and initiate, or they were people who were studying with a particular teacher. So these books can be very hard to read, and they're not, in many cases, not nearly as straightforward or seemingly as straightforward as the so-called canonical Gospels.
Which makes sense when you think about it. I mean, one, we're talking about texts from the early days of the church when it was still being hunted by the Romans, and then the Gnostics have had an uneasy at best relationship with Orthodox, and then later when the split happened in the 11th century, Catholic Christianity. I mean, from what I know, a lot of the prominent heresies of the Middle Ages, the Waldensians and the Cathars, for example, had Gnostic influence.
Yeah, I mean, the Cathars in particular. Now, there's been a lot of debate recently, which I think is kind of interesting, as to whether the Cathars, people were saying that the Cathars as such didn't actually exist, that it was mostly a myth about these French heretics or whatnot. I can't speak to that. I haven't really had a chance to look into that.
I'm going to have to look into it. I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a huge move towards study of Gnosticism and Gnostic-related groups. That I can absolutely tell you. A lot of it's going on down at Rice University, which has an excellent religion department. Dr. April DeConnick is, you know, perhaps one of the premier scholars there. There's folks like Dylan Burns and Nicola Denzi Lewis, and there's some really great younger scholars and people, you know, who are kind of taking the mantle from Elaine Pagels and Karen King and are moving forward with this. But there's a lot of question right now. You know, again, who were these Gnostics? Were they worthy competitors to Orthodox churches, or were they always this kind of fringe movement of heretics and lunatics? A lot of questions.
There are, and it is an interesting topic. I've picked up on it. Usually, more tangentially studying other things. Certainly years back when the whole Dan Brown nonsense came out. And the original Holy Blood, Holy Grail nonsense that preceded it, I did some research into the whole subject, and just the fact, you know, there's some really fascinating things there, but some of it, especially then, gets mired in so much myth and silliness, to be completely honest. When you get into the conspiracy
I mean, I think that that can be one way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. I think another way of looking at it is that this may have made sense in a particular context. And since we don't have access to that context anymore, you know, we can't make the same kind of sense.
Mm-hmm.
You know, again, who were these Gnostics? Were they worthy competitors to Orthodox churches, or were they always this kind of fringe movement of heretics and lunatics? And since we don't have access to that context anymore, you know, we can't make the same kind of sense. of it that other people were able to.
That's fair. I'm more saying some of the goofy conspiracy theories that have grown up around not the beliefs. I'm not disrespecting the beliefs.
A lot of that you got to remember is what makes good fiction isn't necessarily, the pure truth. The pure truth of things, especially in history, is often a little anticlimactic, or it's not as exciting. So if you're going to do a series of thrillers, you got to spice it up a little.
Which is fair for Dan Brown, but it's less fair for the Holy Blood, Holy Grail that gave him the idea.
Well, yes, if somebody's pretending to be a historian and they're just peddling pure fiction, that's a problem.
Yeah. And pure fiction that allows people to take advantage of other folks through, their own literature and their own fake history and that sort of thing. So that can be a bit irksome, certainly.
Yeah, but the original beliefs themselves, at least, then again, it's also my personal nature. I find all belief fascinating, whether I share it or not.
Sure.
But I just find it interesting in the evolution of Christianity and some of the ideas of, certainly when you look at the history of the church compared to today, compared to older times, and the what's the word I'm looking for? Rejection of the material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As definitely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think that for people, particularly in the U.S., who were raised on a kind of a Protestant literalism, the Bible, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word of God. The idea that there were other books, that there was a debate, that the Bible did not get handed down to human beings down directly from the heavens. Can be a bit much to think about. And the fact that there were debates over which books ended up in the Bible. Martin Luther himself wasn't crazy about several books in the Bible, including the book of James, which he called the Gospel of Straw. So I mean, I think it's important for people to keep in mind that this idea of a paper pope, so to speak, is not, it has not always been in Christianity. And so when you find these additional books and writings and teachings, there may be a good time to pause and take a look at them and say, okay, well, is this giving us a fuller idea of Christian history, or was this always excluded? And there are people who will say that. I mean, there are some scholars who will say, look, there were heretics back in the early days of the church. You're always going to have heretics, but that this was never really these were never really mainstream teachings. They were always sidelined, and we really need to not give them too much attention. It's a different perspective, but I think it's a tension that scholars now are dealing more and more with.
Well, it's an interesting idea, it sounds like.
I mean, even as a Christian, I'm very much not I was raised Catholic, but I'm not of the highly biblical literalist mindset. Just because it's like the history, even looking at the canonical, Old Testament. Well, which books you want to call the Old Testament? What Protestants call the Old Testament isn't the same books that Catholics call the Old Testament or Orthodox call the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And then we can get into, aside from the Deuterocanonical books, there's a whole Apocrypha that certainly some of the ideas in which seem to influence the early Christians. So it's very simplistic to say, well, okay, this is all that we can accept, but it's like the history is a lot more complicated than that. And that we haven't even gotten into the way that various other cultures shaped even the early books of the Bible. There's the theory I've been hearing lately that I keep meaning to do more research on, that one of the first two chapters of Genesis was added later. That's actually one that's been kicked around for a while. When you have a couple of different creation stories, you have, man and woman being created at once, and then you have one being, the woman's being taken out of a man through his rib and that sort of thing. Absolutely. There's a lot of controversy in biblical studies, and there's also a lot of controversy
within certain communities as to whether biblical studies is even worth doing, because people come to biblical studies with so much baggage.
Oh,
There
good heavens,
are
yes.
there's the mythicist community, for example, who believes that the person of Jesus Christ, never existed, and that the books that were written were actually about him are actually myths that were put together out of whole cloth, and were used to, in some cases, subdue the masses politically. And that particular perspective, it has gained a lot of attention. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really quite fascinating. Biblical studies is a fascinating area.
Yeah, with actually, particularly with Easter coming around, I keep thinking about it. It's like, we need to do an episode about the mythicist movement and why it's, well, frankly, BS. It's like, setting aside the issue, of whether Jesus was God or in any other way supernatural or divine, I can make a good historically sound case for the Gospels at least being based on an actual person who did at least some of the non-supernatural things connected to it.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, some of the mythicists just make me crazy.
Yeah, it's a perspective. It's gotten quite a bit of attention.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of those things that merits ongoing consideration. And certainly, you're getting a lot of bright folks who are contributing to this, and I say that that's all to the good. If we can get people asking questions and pushing each other,
Oh, I agree, absolutely.
Iron sharpens iron. Let's get this. Let's get these questions going and ask. And there's a lot more technology these days.
Mm-hmm.
There are different ways of being able to look at old documents. You can run language patterns through computers. There's a lot of technology that can help with this as well.
This is true.
Yeah. I think it's all great.
And the exploration, I think it's one of those things that it's like, even if we can't answer the question, or whichever direction we answer the question, I think we're going to get useful information along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think absolutely. I mean, that there's this process that happens, and there's all kinds of some very fruitful stuff can emerge.
Yeah, and there's I think there's a degree of intelligence in the mythicist community. I have a bias against it because most of my original contact with it was with a woman known as D.M. Murdoch, or by her pen name Akira S. And her stuff is just out in left field. Like, my personal favorite is Jesus is based on the Greek god Dionysus, and a major part of her evidence was that Dionysus is the only begotten son of Zeus. It's like, have you read a book on classical mythology in your life?
Well, there's a great quote that fits this from Luke Skywalker. Every word in that sentence was wrong. Quite amazing.
Well, yeah, and I think that this hits on something that's really important when it comes to anything regarding the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal. If you have a body of study, a discipline or a study or an area of study that has been marginalized people are going to be the only ones who are working in it. Yeah. And so you've got folks who may be well-intended and actually pretty smart, but who don't have access to scholarly tools, have not been trained in scholarly methods, do not have the benefit of publishing in peer-reviewed journals so there can be a back and forth. You're going to get some very strange stuff.
Yeah.
And what's happened now with occultism, Western esotericism, Gnosticism, these somewhat fringe areas are now actually being included in the academy. And it's possible to study these things critically. And again, you're less likely to have a cottage industry of people who decided to descend a rabbit hole very ill-equipped and started writing stuff that people now repeat to each other and turn into memes that are completely false.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an exciting time.
It is, and again, it's all history fascinates me, and belief fascinates me. Yeah. Whether I agree with something or not, it doesn't mean I don't find the pursuit interesting.
Personally, I want to learn more about Brian the child that was born in the manger next to Jesus. I think he's fascinating. I think he's a very understudied,
underrated character.
He's an understudied biblical figure.
I'm sorry, the pagan in the room was lost.
It's a Monty Python reference.
You don't know My Life of Brian? I'm very disappointed
the Life of
in
Brian
you, Beth.
is a fantastic
It's
movie.
one of my all-time favorites.
I love it.
And it is, and it's actually so smart about religion, which is why I love it, because in between being funny, it also hits on so many of the the best arguments.
People sometimes forget about the Pythons. They were comedians, but they were comedians who were educated at Cambridge.
Yeah,
they were very smart men.
They're very smart guys, and their humor reflects it.
Yeah, no, they were, and I remember there's actually, after that movie came out, it was all very controversial. So they had some talk show where I think it was Michael Palin and John Cleese were on the show with some extremely proper Anglican archbishop, and hilarity did ensue.
That sounds great.
It was one of the most British things you'll ever see in your life.
I'm gonna have
you
to
can
look
go
this
on
up.
YouTube and find it.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah,
It's like the two of them and an Anglican bishop. This can't not be funny. It's like
that's gonna be great.
Yeah, and he was a splendid Anglican bishop, and he was just an absolutely splendid bishop. And he was not amused, but he was also not going to be ruffled by all this. I mean, as I said, it was one of the most British things I've ever seen in my life.
Oh, nice.
I really need just that image of a very British bishop.
Yeah.
Offended, but no, he's too British.
He can't let it out. He must keep it in.
Exactly. It would be perfect. Just the slow burn. Yeah.
Stiff up a lip and all that.
If you're wondering, Lainie, that would be Beth. She's our producer. Keeps us
excellent.
relatively honest.
Yes, if you're wondering who that strange voice is.
Those are the boys. Don't worry. I got your back.
No, we've got, I think, a very effective triangle here of me as the Christian, Brian as the agnostic, and Beth as the pagan.
Excellent.
So, as interesting as all this is, one thing I've found fascinating, and I haven't looked into a whole lot. Tell us a little bit about your candle ministry.
Yeah. Okay. This started last year. It's been a really difficult couple of years here in the U.S. And particularly with the election, and there's been this kind of there's been a rise in some very brutal ideas, very brutal politics.
Yeah.
And I think I began to notice that people were feeling incredibly helpless. And I felt like something had to be done here because people are just feeling helpless and they feel like they can't do anything. So I decided to, partly as just something that I could do, is I decided to start lighting candles for people. If they had an intention, they wanted to do something in memory of somebody or a Thanksgiving or something along those lines. And I started, so I started to light candles for people, and I would just started live streaming it on Facebook, and this ended up just kind of really developing into a ministry. So I'm probably doing lightings, at least a couple times a week. And people from all over, send me their requests, and I light the candle and put those candles up, and then I say a few words during the candle lighting on Facebook, and it's really been, I think, a very positive thing. For one thing, it was a ministry that I could have. I was recovering from some health problems when I started it, including a very badly sprained ankle and some other stuff. So I felt like I could do stuff. But then I began to realize that a lot of people who may be feeling helpless, the thing that I've found, if I'm feeling paralyzed by anxiety or depression or whatnot, is I can learn to just do something. Just take one tiny action, and that actually can increase the space around me such that I feel like I can actually do more. I can feel more liberated and able to act more. And I realized that for some people, being able to request a candle for themselves or somebody else was giving that little bit of space where they could move and say, okay, I was able to do this. Now, what can I do now? I think that's been a very important part of the ministry. The other important part is that The candles, I mean, I have names on them for folks, but you can't see the candles' names when they're being lit because of the way I film it. As I point out to everybody, every single light represents a person or their intentions or their desires or their needs or their grief or, their blessings. And even if you don't like a person, even if you and this person may have very different beliefs about things, right now, all we're asking you to do is give your attention, give your prayers toward the lights. And that, we do all have to coexist. And this is one way of coexisting and being able to extend real charity to others, even if they're not folks we would want to associate with. So.
Nice.
Wow. That's even more brilliant than I thought it was. And I had a high opinion of it to begin with.
Yeah, you explained it very well.
So as a general summary, it's essentially using the power and connection of the internet along with what you are leading so many people into. It's essentially a group Reiki therapy session.
Well, I wouldn't use. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily. I wouldn't use the word Reiki, but I would say yes. There's a sense here that there is a community that supports the ministry, and they do it online in many cases by being able to direct their prayers or their energies, however they choose to define it. And I've got people who are atheists that request candles. I have people who are Christians, people who are pagans, all kinds. And it's a way for us to get together and direct that toward the lights that I've set.
No
and it's also a way
Reiki.
to give people attention too, because I think a lot of times a lot of people feel like they're disappearing, that there isn't, that they're overwhelmed and they feel like nobody can give them the attention that they need. And this is another way of being able to take just a few moments to draw our attention to somebody else, into some other purposes. So it's that as well.
And to give people that to give the people that sense that somebody still cares. Which
yeah.
That's why I say more on a spiritual level, because, and like I said, Reiki was essentially the most not watered down but most generic example I could think of, essentially, as far as it being a community gathering.
See, it still reminds me, like, growing up Catholic, it reminds me of the lighting lights.
Yeah.
I think it does come down to, it's not the concept. The basic concept definitely has spiritual roots. I mean, obviously.
Well, there's a few. Like, isn't there a similar Japanese tradition with the lanterns? Like on one of the holidays, they light the paper lanterns and send them out on boats, and they represent prayers and.
As I understand it, it's
thoughts.
more. I thought it was usually more regrets. Things you're letting go of.
That's more regrets and a sort of renewal.
Okay.
You're thinking of.
Okay.
Similar concept to a degree, but not exact. That's more of a community actually physically gathers together.
Yeah. No, I know that the lighting of candles or the lighting of fires is a fairly common thread in a lot of cultures when doing stuff like that.
Well, I mean, since ancient times, fire's been associated with the divine. I mean, God didn't speak through the pile of dirt to Moses. It was a burning bush. That was irreverent, and I approve.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, and the fire itself is interesting to work with. There's some nights when I'm lighting quite a few candles, and I'll be wrestling with the fire. I mean, some fires will be less control, will be less under control or more under control. There'll be times when I'm having difficulty making sure that the candles, when I'm lighting the candles, that nothing is falling over, or that I'm not getting a bit of wick that burns off, or a bit of the I use a little wooden taper to light the candles, that's not burning off. And it's an interesting thing working with the fire. Just working with fire itself has proven to be a very interesting practice.
Well, fire's a fun thing, but it does have a long history of being used as a means of communing with the other side or gods.
I was going to say, we're at the half-hour mark, so I did want to give out the phone number in case anybody wants to call in. 609-807-2492. 609-807-2492. Remember, we're talking to Bishop Lainie Peterson. It's been a great chat so far.
Yeah, no, it's very. It's
you know,
very interesting.
when we met a few months back, I'm like, oh, she'd be perfect, and yeah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh no, this has been great. This is great. I love doing this.
The only problem I'm seeing so far is it feels like there's more topics than we have time to cover.
Probably,
That
but
happens
that's
with every guest we have.
yeah, that's pretty much a common.
Especially for their first
thread here.
interview, or not interview, but the first time that they're on the show.
This
Yeah.
is true.
That's why we make room to invite them back.
Yeah, it's like that's the upside. Do I hear one of your cats?
You do. You're hearing little hops right now.
That's why I was wondering if what that was.
Speaking of when we first met, Cliff has actually joined us in the chat.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
Nice. So you're out in Chicago, right? What
I am.
what part?
I'm on the north side, pretty far north.
Oh, nice.
It's an area sometimes called West Ridge, sometimes called West Rogers Park, but
Okay.
it's a few miles from the Evanston border to the north. So it's pretty much on the north side,
Okay.
and it's a nice neighborhood. It's a nice neighborhood. Chicago is a very interesting place. I recommend that everybody come visit.
Yeah, I lived out
and
there for
so-
about 7 years.
Where'd you live?
I lived in Palatine.
Oh man.
And then Elgin, and what's the other one? It was Des Plaines. It was all up in the northwest suburbs.
Yeah, northwest suburbs.
areas,
Yep.
but,
Yeah, that's where I grew up.
But visited the city a few times, and it was very cool.
Never been to
Yeah.
Chicago.
It's interesting. It's a different kind of vibe than like New York or other cities out here. Just hard to put your finger on like why, but it's just different. Just like California has a whole different feel to it.
Yeah, no, Chicago definitely has its own vibe. It is a hotbed of religion and spirituality of all kinds. People don't realize it, but we've got one of the biggest clusters in the world of divinity schools and seminaries and graduate programs in religion. So we've got schools in the suburbs. We've got schools, on the north side. We've got a huge cluster of schools in Hyde Park on the south side. So there's a lot of that. There's also been a fair amount of occult activity in the area. Michael Bertio is in Chicago. He's known of the Voodoo Gnostic workbook. We have in the city one of the possibly the oldest occult bookstore in the Western Hemisphere, possibly one of the oldest in the world. It's not real clear, but it's one of the. It is if not the oldest, it is one of the oldest continuously owned bookstores
Nice.
in the world. That's the occult bookstore on Milwaukee Avenue. We've got the OTO is here. There is just all kinds of activity
Yeah, some
in
big
the area.
cemeteries out there that would spark Kevin's interest.
I was gonna say, since nobody else has made the joke, I have to point out, and you've got Dresden.
Yeah, Harry Dresden, resident wizard of Chicago.
We're both fans of the series. The joke had to be made.
And Amy Semple McPherson, the great Pentecostal evangelist, she was ordained on North Avenue in Chicago.
Oh.
So there's just a lot of history here and a lot of stuff that's gone on spiritually, and there's still a lot of spiritual activity to this day. So it's quite something.
Cool. So you mentioned that your church kind of rides the border with like Gnosticism, but also the occult and the esoteric.
Oh yeah,
So
that's pretty standard from those modern Gnostic churches. Not all of them, but many of them.
So can you expand
many
on
of
that?
them, the folks who are involved are practicing esotericists, but that's not always true. Not always true.
Can you expand on any of that?
Well,
Like what that
I
involves?
think in my case, we do straddle that a bit. The folks who participate in our services these days, when we have them, tend to be practicing occultists. Some of them are even involved with pagan groups or Golden Dawn groups or Hellenic groups or something like that, but they do enjoy our mass, which is similar in many ways to a standard Catholic mass, but there's some key differences. There's also there's also the sense of community that you can get from folks who have similar spiritual interests. I think one of the things is that because I went to seminary. I went to a mainline Protestant seminary. Not everybody, not all Gnostic clergy or independent clergy have done this, but I did. And one of the interesting things is that there is this sense in much of mainline Protestant Christianity that the supernatural, there's no such thing as a so-called supernatural, that you might worship God through songs, but there's no real interactivity. And the thing is, occultists and esotericists, by our very nature, believe that there is actual activity going on between humanity and the divine. So I think that we're a bit more open to that. And there are things that I might be called upon to do that some clergy mainline clergy may not be called to do, because they're just not operating with the idea of perhaps demonic oppression or curses or things like that. So there's a little bit more of that involved in some of the work that I do.
And the fact that mainline clergy, and the fact that even it's a lot of people who should know better don't, is a large part of why this show is here. Just there's the line from Scripture that always brings to mind when I doing this. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly with the occult, too much knowledge of the wrong sort can be a dangerous thing. Too little knowledge is also. And I think possibly the most dangerous in my experience is just a little bit of knowledge where you think you know.
That's what they always say, is that a little bit of knowledge is a very dangerous thing.
Some of the biggest problems you clean up.
Well, and I think that sometimes what will occur, and this is something that I've encountered countless times, is people will have develop an interest in the occult. So they'll go out and buy some books and make up some tools or something like that, and decide to do something without any understanding or expectation that something is actually going to manifest. Mm-hmm. And then they're shocked and horrified when they start having perhaps paranormal experiences or displaying signs of physical or mental distress when they've been poking around in various regions, and then they're shocked when there's actually something actually happens. And
oh crap! It
worked. And you stop them and you say, well, what did you expect? And they said, well, I thought this was all just psychological self-improvement. Well, and so when you talk about too little or too much knowledge, you have people who perhaps, going back to my notion of much of mainstream Protestantism and probably Catholicism, if you get down to it, being very secular in many ways, with no idea, real notion of interaction between the various realms of being. Yeah. This is the kind of stuff that does happen, and then people wonder why they're having these bad effects. Well, if you had approached this with a bit of reverence and respect, maybe you wouldn't be in your predicament.
Especially just because it's like, and it's something that drives me crazy about modern Christianity. It's like, we didn't used to be like this.
No, and then you've got there are some churches that are like this. You've got some people in various Pentecostal and fundamentalist churches and whatnot who are absolutely convinced of ongoing communication with the spirits or in the spiritual realm, but they might have their own understanding of how that works. But when you move into people to the more mainstream churches where you might not have pull up political baggage or social baggage that's been attached to the religion, somehow or another, the notion there's an increasing secularism that I think actually kind of inhibits what I think a religion ought to be, which is that which assists people in their relationship with the divine, specifically through reverence, honor, and worship. But if you have no real sense of the divine because you don't expect to have any sense of the divine, your ability to worship it effectively, I think, is going to be greatly diminished. And then if you've got somebody from this background who decides, well, I'm going to look into the occult, but takes with them this secular mindset as they investigate the occult or esotericism, and then stuff starts happening, well, that's because they went into it something that's distinctly non-secular with a secular attitude.
Yeah, and that's, I'll say the one I run into, the other end of the spectrum that drives me crazy, I've been running into lately is, of course, the Christians that go as far down the other end as you could go and see demons everywhere.
Oh yeah, everything is the result of the devil or demons.
It's and you grasp very well, but other people don't. There's a tightrope of realizing the material and the importance of the spiritual. Just case in point, watching a talented magician on Asia's Got Talent, who does a decent magic act, but she does it dressed up as Sadako, basically.
Oh, that's awesome.
And she sells it because, she's doing these creepy twitches, and she barely speaks. It's mostly gesturing and then saying something real brief and real creepy. She does a series of sleight of hand tricks and then point to, two of the judges and then points to the middle one and goes, "She helped me. She helped me." And she had handed the middle judge a Polaroid she had just taken of her, and she opens her hands to show the Polaroid, and now the girl's in the picture. And but she does this, and what she's doing isn't super complex magic. It's pretty clear how she does it to anybody who knows a little bit about it or takes a little time to do research on YouTube. But you have people swearing it's like, oh, she's possessed and it's the work of the devil. It's like, no, she's just a good actress.
See, this is what I was telling you before about the difference between the magic and the showmanship. And obviously she's really got the showmanship down.
On the whole other side, it's like, she's a moderately talented magician.
Yeah.
I've seen much better.
Sure.
But she's a phenomenal show.
Exactly, which often is more the point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because that's where it comes down to. I mean, you've got how many actors that you see aren't really all that talented, but they've got something, they've got a flair or a sense of how to present themselves and a certain appeal, and it just makes all the difference.
To be fair, that didn't save the cast from Shadow of the Vampire.
No, but when you're dealing with a real vampire, I mean,
there's
only so much you can do.
As far as like different representations of various Christian figures, let's take Lucifer as an example. One of my favorites is the version from Dawn, Lucifer's Halo. And it's hilarious because they paint him as this like over-the-top drama queen, whereas when they show God, they actually represent him by Ahura Mazda, which I thought was hilarious. And the analyses of the relationship there, which bordered on a few levels that it's not safe for work. But then when you look at the show Lucifer, like that snarky little, I've got daddy's issues, but I'm gonna wear it with style. You can't find no chip on my shoulder. Sort of cavalier.
I do kind of like that idea of Lucifer as the drama queen.
He is a drama queen. When he decided to have a tantrum, he had a war.
Yep.
Or the line from Prophecy of, sitting in your basement, moaning over your breakup with the boss.
Saying over your breakup with the boss. Yep. Such a great
fair,
movie.
When he wants your
and
attention,
again, Viggo
like,
Mortensen.
Yep.
Viggo Mortensen played
one of the finest
hell of a
devils
devil.
ever on film.
That was like, God is love. I don't love you.
Yep.
Well, geez, tell us how you really feel.
Although I think my favorite portrayal of God still has to go back to George Burns.
Oh, good Lord, yes.
In the Oh God
Oh
movies.
Lord.
Yeah, I grew up with watching the. If I'm gonna.
So did I.
Yeah. When I think about it, it's like it always goes back to George Burns. That's kind of the way you hope God actually would be.
And unlike most trilogies, for a lot of people from most trilogies, I think the third of them is my favorite. Oh, God, him as both God and Satan.
Yeah. Well, he got to have a lot of fun playing the devil. and kind of
was
stole
that
it.
the one where the devil was like, "Do you know how I got this gig?" God turned to me and goes, "Here, put this on."
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I remember seeing that a long, long time ago.
Yeah,
when I was, like,
they're in
5,
Vegas.
Yeah.
and I could never find it.
Playing poker over the guy's soul at the end.
Yep.
And God cheats.
There's actually a webcomic called A Day in the Life of God, which is hilarious.
So how about you? What do you any thoughts on it? We normally tangent into pop culture
We've been
territory.
fairly remarkably on
Well,
target.
I remember.
We did.
I remember. Oh God, the original movie. He was talking about how he made a mistake with flamingos. He put the kneecaps on backwards.
Yeah. There's so many great jokes in that movie.
Yeah, and John Denver was great in that film.
Yep.
I mean, it was some good stuff. It was some really good stuff.
And I was just thinking of the joke I made when I doing a stream a month or two back with an atheist, and talking about theoretically talking about evolution. It's like, of course, God's got a sense of humor. How else do you explain the platypus evolving?
Exactly.
Or my own mentor, the late Father Joe, the famous part of the Bible where the donkey is given the power of speech. It was a joke. Why, and it's one of the problems I've always had with mainline Catholicism. They take it, I agree with the importance of reverence. I agree with the importance of worship. But do we have to take everything so seriously?
Well, it's kind of like what they say in Dogma, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like you guys don't worship your religion or rejoice or celebrate it. You mourn it.
It's interesting. The notion of ball and fast, the talking donkey. It's interesting when you read 20th century Pentecostals who had women preachers, which was relatively unusual. It happened. It did exist, but it was relatively unusual. And when they were challenged on why they had women preachers, the Pentecostals would say, well, look at Balaam's ass. If a donkey can preach for God, so can a woman. And, of course, one was left with the idea of, friends like these. Women clergy really didn't need any enemies. But, if you want to take that story to its, logical, serious conclusion, that's the way that's actually been played out in church history.
That makes sense to me, too. And I don't, personally, being a slightly smart-alecked person, I don't necessarily see the two as mutually exclusive. I mean,
yeah,
a good, if you want to take a little bit of the trickster element, which I'm always so fond of, it's like, God may have been doing a bit of trolling, but it wouldn't shock me to say, yeah, guess what? He had a point there, too.
Yeah.
Because, if a donkey can preach, why not? Why not?
It sounds like the setup for what started the Vicar of Dibley. So,
Vicar of Dibley. Oh yeah, great show.
It's amazing. I love Dawn French.
Yeah, I mean the woman who played her friend recently died. The actress.
Yeah, the actress who played Alice. I heard about that and I was just crushed. It was like, no.
Yeah, that was very sad.
I'm the Alice in the group.
And sadly, we're not quite out of time yet. I just wanted to say we're at 7:21.
Yeah.
So I was going to give the number out a second time. If anybody wants to call in, now's the time.
Yes. And now's also usually the time where we let you plug anything you have upcoming or that you want people to know about.
Well, if anybody's interested in the candle ministry, you can go on Facebook, Bishop Lainie's Candle Burning Ministry. Just plug that in and you'll find the page there. And that'll, bring you up there. So yeah, and that's again kind of the focus of my ministry these days, and I'm happy to burn candles. My rule is I don't anybody can request a candle for pretty much any purpose. It's free of charge. I do have a Patreon and a Amazon wish list if people want to contribute, but there's no charge. There's no cost involved. So anybody can request a candle, and you can request as many candles as you need. Don't put that kind of limit. This is my ministry. This is what I do. So don't be shy. I've had some people say recently, oh, I haven't asked for one because I figure people need it more than I do. Well, actually, no, that's not the way it works. Everybody is welcome to ask for a candle. And there's actually something to be said for having a lot of candles up there. There's a tremendous amount of power in seeing these intentions all brought together.
Oh, nice. Maybe you can light one for me to get me a date with Christina Ricci.
Oh. Well, I don't usually do manipulative stuff.
As long shots go, that's about as long
Wait, what, you
odds
want a
as
date with Christina Ricci? What?
Christina Ricci.
Yeah. That's an interesting one, Brian.
I'll be happy to meet Adrian Paul. I would give him the biggest hug. I'm sure he wouldn't be able to hear much of what I have to say because I grew up on Highlander, but he probably doesn't want to hear it anyway. Or Christopher Lambert, either one. But
if we want to be practical for a minute, the show still needs sponsors.
Yeah.
This is true. Also, we do have some extra time tonight, so per the management.
Okay.
So we
Cool.
have like an extra 15 minutes or so.
Just as we're preparing to shut down and wind down.
Lucky for us, we have a really nice station manager.
Yes.
So I'm going to give the number out again since we do have a little bit extra time, but in case anybody out there does want to call in, now is the appointed time, as it were. 609-807-2492, 609-807-2492.
And now is the time where I invite the crowd to tell me to release any of the prisoners.
Release the Kraken!
Release Roger!
For that matter, if anybody is listening on Facebook, I do have the chat open. Feel free to ask a question through there if you are unable or just too shy to call in.
You should probably start having the YouTube up in another chat, just.
Yeah, that occurred to me. I don't remember why I forgot to do it today. So I should do that.
Yes, you can also find that reminds me you can find our shows on YouTube if you want to look back for previous episodes and things.
And we recently got a Twitter.
Oh yes, you can follow us on Twitter.
Oh, excellent.
Twitter, Patreon, YouTube, Facebook.
We're all over. We're conquering social media.
Somebody's supposed to be setting up an Instagram.
Ryan.
Yeah, I don't know who that is.
Oh, that's right. You're Ryan today, aren't you?
I'm Waja.
Rabbit?
No.
First, I have to learn what Instagram is.
Yeah, that might be good starts.
Yeah, I don't know why I wasn't put in charge of that. I'm like the worst person you could put in charge of this.
It's because I'm the boss. Beth had to go through all the trouble to set up the Twitter.
I can't manage my own social media.
Do you want to just give me your information so I can start doing that for you? I literally have nothing better to do.
Sure. I could definitely use the help.
You volunteered, Beth.
Yeah,
Yep.
but he doesn't know what I'm going to do to it.
Oh, poor Brian.
Get him blocked by Trump. That'll boost his sales.
That sounds like a badge of honor.
Hey,
really.
yeah, I would wear that proudly.
I know. That's why I said... I've said some outrageous things.
Wait, we're on Twitter. This are people I need to troll.
Oh, there's so many.
Well, there's one atheist I watch on YouTube who's commented before that anyone who annoys Kid Ham enough to mention on air is good enough to get on the show. So it's on my bucket list to tick off Kid Ham because he's also the guy who has the Ark Park.
Oh my God.
The Ark, the replica Ark that was built in Kentucky with $100
like taxpayer
million
money.
of taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, which I think now they're telling him to pay back, which is good.
And there's a whole series of shady things he's done. I mean,
yeah, that guy's
basically they said,
tool.
okay, we need to put because we need extra EMS and police and fire to take care of your gigantic death trap because it's a giant building made out of wood. We're going to charge you a tax. So he turns around and sells it to his nonprofit for $10 to get out of it. Yeah. And it's like,
twerp.
Really, dude? Thankfully, that didn't work because the judge went, no, I'm not putting up with that nonsense.
He's got like dinosaurs there in among the Ark.
I will say this because I've watched a couple of video tours. Some of the artwork in it is lovely because they actually got some very talented artists.
I'm sure
that's about the nicest thing I can say about it.
Yeah, that's pretty much the only.
And also,
Regardless,
it's like
pay your taxes.
Yeah. And also, just for heaven's sakes, it's like setting aside biblical literalism. There are better things to have done with all of that money.
Yeah, maybe like, I don't know,
Help the homeless.
feed starving people, or or help the homeless. Things that Jesus might have actually approved of.
Like when I think of things, things I think that God would approve of and find worthwhile. I don't think of giant megachurches and life-size to scale arcs. I think of things like Lainie's candle ministry.
Yeah.
It's like,
Things that actually do something positive and bring
it's
something.
simple. It's designed to try to help people find hope, and you're not charging.
And I
people
have a
an
strong
arm and a leg.
commitment to safety.
Yes.
Probably more so than the Ark encounter.
Well, I mean, I keep my little spray thing of my fire extinguisher nearby, and
Good.
in a fireplace so it's on brick. It's one of the things whenever I teach a class in candle work, I always say, safety is first. You don't have a ministry if you're not looking out for safety.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and that's very true.
And I've known a few people over the years that it's like, okay, you're gonna go run off and do this, you're gonna do magic, you're gonna do spiritual, you're gonna do ghost hunting, and it's like, the obvious safety concern didn't occur to you.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a ministry. You're not thinking about anybody else. That's just not a ministry. It's not good work. It's not positive work. There's nothing beneficent about it if you are overlooking basic safety for everybody.
But I think one of our regular listeners, Will Patrizzi, has an excellent question.
Oh,
why would God need a starship?
Yes. Probably the best thing to come out of that movie. That was, I mean, I'm a Star Trek fan, and that is not one of the series' high points. I'll tell you, I'll give you that one.
No, Niles as Moriarty was.
Yeah.
I did not realize that was Niles.
Yeah, that's Niles from The Nanny.
Oh, I was thinking of a different Niles.
But no, he was fantastic. But no, the line, what does God need with a starship, is probably the best thing to come out of Star Trek V.
If you couldn't have guessed, a lot of our listeners like us are nerds.
Yes.
What was it?
I can't imagine, nerds liking a paranormal show.
That'd never happen. Twice a week.
Yeah.
3 times on Sundays.
With a revolutionary Thursday. Right before the show.
Although there is at least the one answer I could think of to that question. It's like, well, if you're going by traditional Christian theology, if Jesus wanted to go to another planet, Jesus would have taken a starship.
Mm.
Is this where he played David Bowie's Starman?
Yeah.
It seems appropriate.
But I think the main follow-up question to that is, why do some of these preachers with the megachurch need those jets?
Mm.
Yeah. It's like, you still, my mentor, one of my favorite. Yeah,
Will corrected you. He said it's Frasier.
What is he talking about?
The Niles I was thinking of when you said Niles was Niles from Frasier.
No, it wasn't
Right.
Niles from Frasier.
Oh no,
Niles
he's talking
from the
about
Butler from
Beth is talking about the guy who played Moriarty on Star Trek: The Next Generation. Played the
I think he's
snarky
thinking that
butler on The Nanny.
That because the Niles I was thinking of was the Niles from Frasier.
Yeah, you hear Niles and you don't really. Not as many people are familiar with The Nanny.
I've seen the Nanny once or twice, but not in many years.
Yeah, it was not.
many
It was not a
times.
great show.
It came on before Law and Order, so we just started watching it. It was great.
I didn't think anything came on before Law and Order. I thought Law and Order just kind of was.
No, because it was
And
ER,
it just-
which everybody ignored once George Clooney left.
Mm.
And that was on from like 2 to 5, and that's when the Nanny came on. Yeah, that's where you got to start.
Yeah.
Well, although Clooney was actually on a number of canceled pilots
True, but
and
it's the thing
TV
that made him
shows.
famous.
Yeah, ER is what finally clicked for him.
And
I think they should bring Chris Tice's show back.
I still think the ultimate
That's a long time ago.
Law and Order series idea that was perfect was we need the following Law and Order. The people are represented by 3 equally important groups: the police who
Police who investigate
investigate crimes, The
District
district attorneys who prosecuted and the MFing Batman.
There might be some licensing issues with that one. See, I would be,
True, it would make a great show.
it would. I would be satisfied with Law and Order Special Vampires Unit.
Actually, did you know that they actually have to have there's a specific department for whenever they want to use departments and stuff in like police department stuff in movies that they have to contact in order to get like their numbers to make sure that it's not an actual live unit.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Yeah, they use
Well,
it
especially in New York, they
even back when the Barney Miller was on the air, because
Yeah.
it was like
yeah, they have
crazy.
like a film and TV department because they get used so often in movies and television.
That's interesting. Did not know that.
Yeah.
And yet again, we're way off topic.
Oh yeah, way off.
I'm just
now.
disappointed, particularly by virtue of how on topic we've stayed tonight.
This is what happens when you give us extra airtime. We just waste it.
This is all Gene's fault.
We
clearly.
fritter it away, obviously.
This,
you know.
this is expanding out.
What? What was that about, Joe? Oh, when we used.
Remember when we had to?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, we used to waste time like it was our job.
Well, to be fair.
It kind of is our job.
Exactly. That's what made that joke so funny. All right, so our poor guest is sitting around now wondering what's
Like,
going
what
on.
did I get myself
Feel
into?
free to chime in, by the way, or if there's anything else that you'd like to say and leave our listeners with.
I'm grateful for being brought on the show, and I do encourage everybody, whether if you're not on any kind of spiritual path or practice, that's one thing. If you are, I do encourage people to practice mindfully. Whether it's with candles or if you're doing some kind of spirit work or whatever, I do encourage people to practice mindfully. As Kevin knows, I have experience with helping folks who did not practice carefully and are now reaping the consequences.
Enjoy the occult response.
Without violating anyone's confidentiality, it's fair to say that's how we met.
Yeah. And, it's just one of those things. I hate being like mom and wagging my finger, but I guess I kind of have to here. I understand having an interest in these matters, but there's also the importance of considering the ramifications of what you're trying to do and taking precautions to protect yourself and others.
Oh, absolutely. It's like, trust me, we had Arthur on, who I know you know, and him talking about the guy who managed to get the money he needed by summoning a demon and to burn down his house. Or there's the paranormal investigator I knew who decided to investigate solo, which is always a bad idea for lots of reasons, most of which aren't paranormal, abandoned school and wound up locked up inside the school with voices screaming at him to get out.
Not wise.
No.
No, and then you have people that, just because they exist, just attract all of the crap.
This is true.
Then you got people that swing swords around wildly in people's houses and play video games.
Oh yes.
while pretending to
I
pretending
work with
to
the way
perform
Crowley does it, so that's the right
investigations.
way. Dude, no. I will smack you into the next 5 dimensions.
Although let's face it, Marcus wasn't even on time doing because Crowley had at least a vague clue of what he was doing. The Mr. Swing the Sword around with the video games.
That to me is still the
Crowley was
Wasn't
a
on
funniest.
that
drug
level.
addict Who had a bare concept and kind of touched on some things, but that's not enough to make up for the illicit crap he did.
I kind of like Crowley because you have to give him credit for this, if nothing else. He was one of the most honestly dishonest people you'll ever hear of.
Are you calling him the king of the honest liars?
Yep.
Yeah, he kind of is.
So he's an insurance salesman. Gotcha.
Lainie, I'm thinking you know him fairly well. Wouldn't you agree? It's like he admitted that he was kind of full of BS at time to time.
Yeah, I think a fair number of these guys did that. He had his shtick, and he ran with it.
Yeah, kind of like
and he
Anton
was
LaVey.
perfectly willing to do what was necessary to keep his shtick going.
Well, the problem with him too, with Crowley in particular, was the way that he had everything set up for, especially as the New Age movement was sort of growing underground. Was everybody had to be a stickler for if somebody wanted to get out of the circle or anything like that, until it got to the point where during one of the ceremonies, there was a drawdown happening, which is where they take the spirit of whatever entity they're summoning in, and they just turn around and goes, "Just walk through." Seriously, this is unnecessary. So it's kind of on the fence. It's essentially a little column A, little column B of whether the priest or priestess was just like done with it. Or if it's just like, guys, seriously, this is the 21st century. Back in the day, maybe, but no, we understand that there's a different decorum now.
And it's the thing. It's like so many of the modern people I see, and I agree. A lot of, especially, one, in general, people who know what they're doing, and two, a lot of the older guard. It's like they have at least a little bit of a sense of humor about themselves. It's some people today just take it all so seriously. It's like it's important to be reverent, and I'm not saying you shouldn't be reverent, but there are days where it's like, okay, you're on a trip to a cemetery to drive out a high-ranking devil to save someone's soul. It's like, if that doesn't sound like the start of a comic book, you're missing something.
Well, I think there's reverence, and then there is egoism that it gets expressed in being holier than thou. Well, I'm the person, I'm the arbiter of what's appropriate here, and if you can't laugh at yourself, you can't laugh at others, you can't show any grace to maybe other people doing things, then you pretty much get what you deserve.
Yeah. So I think the big difference there is reverence comes from having respect for the thing that you're dealing with, whereas self-importance and that lack of sense of humor generally comes from having too high an opinion of yourself. So it's the difference between sort of aggrandizing yourself versus being appropriately respectful to something outside of yourself.
That's true.
Well, and what I would say is also it's an internal state. I mean, your reverence is an internal state. That's your business. That's your state. When you start imposing what you think reverence ought to look like on other people, you're not really so much working on your own internal state. You're back up in your head and being concerned what other people do. You can say, this is what we're doing here. This is how this happens. And somebody's 3-year-old is going to run across a circle. Or somebody's going to fart or something like that. That's going to happen. And, if you can't just deal with, you can't go with that and roll with it. My question is really how reverent are you? That's the question I'm going to ask, because your inner state is not in that place of reverence if you're constantly getting annoyed by supposed violations of spiritual decorum.
And also just that sense of, I think people that, in my experience, that are very spiritual and who have that kind of reverence, there is a sort of peace to things. And just the 3-year-old just ran across the salt circle and salt went everywhere. And it happens. You don't freak out. You just get the container of salt and fix the circle. It sort of makes me think of when I did EMT training, and just the instructor were talking about, doing CPR on a baby, and it's like, well, what do you do if you drop the baby? You pick it up. It's like, just get on with it. Don't get so worked up. And he mentioned it, and it's, I think, again, a good analogy. It's just having people who, the baby gets dropped or something, and they freak out and run out of the house, and it's like, that isn't going to make anything better.
Yeah.
Throwing a fit because a little kid was a little kid in the middle of your ritual.
Yeah.
They're little kids. They're little kids. They can't help it.
Yeah. Maybe not the smartest idea to have the little kid there in the first place.
In a religious ceremony, it's you bring your kids, especially. One of my favorite lines from Jesus when it comes to children. Suffer the little children to come on to me. Don't forbid them. Let them be kids. To me, it's kind of, You need to let kids
Oh
be
yeah,
kids.
no, I mean if you're doing
That's-
something really
yeah.
important with a summoning circle,
Well,
and it can't be maybe
Well,
it's not the
with
best
anytime
place
you're
for a
doing home
3-year-old.
practitioner, though, really, if there's going to be a kid there, do it when they go to bed. And if they're known to be light sleepers, have a backup plan so that
Well,
this way you
Exactly.
if you,
You
get
just
interrupted.
you think about these
similar
things.
analogy, I think, though. Pets, and for a lot of practitioners I've known over the years, animals can be very important. Especially having an animal can be very important, even part of your practice. And what do you do when the cat walks across the salt line? I mean, you
It
can't
should
just
be in
take.
the bathroom or in a bedroom with its litter box, depending on how long you're going to be doing it.
Yeah, but the cat might be. If the cat's part of your practice, that you don't want them necessarily. To put it in the simplest terms, if the cats
Kitty.
are familiar, you're not going to lock them in the bedroom.
Mr. Kitty, this is Yogg-Sothoth. Yogg-Sothoth, this is Mr. Kitty. Enjoy.
No. In that situation, it really needs to be something more appropriate, like, Min's Bon Ponzi Bottoms. This is Yogg-Sothoth.
And this is when Imhotep just appears out of nowhere and strikes you two. I'm going to be sitting here going, I had no part in this.
And I think that also it's like kids, and for them, our kids and animals are more aware of this stuff. The thing I think to consider sometimes when things go sideways, sometimes I think there's a reason. Something's giving you a lighting. Sometimes, there's the one night, in fact, a Halloween years back, where I was, we were trying to get a particular amulet of Amisha's to get blessed because of the nights of the full moon, and we're driving around, and for lack of any better guess, Hermes starts messing with us, particularly with me. And there was this panic and this hyper seriousness little thing, and it's like, guys, calm down. You have time. Line up a little.
He's good for a laugh.
Yeah.
But also, when you actually have to get somewhere, it's fairly important. When you have to get
We
somewhere,
got where we
else.
needed to go, and we got there with plenty of time. He just meddled with the GPS a little.
Well, he can be a bit of a prankster, but it's all in good fun, especially
Yeah.
it's possible you could have gotten into Iraq. So.
And that brings us to the 7:45. So we have, in fact, unfortunately, gone past the 15-minute mark. Should we wrap it up? Is there any final thoughts you want to share, Lainie?
She's already disconnected.
Oh,
All right.
sorry. So that
Cat did it.
is our friend Lainie Peterson. She is a bishop. If you haven't heard, check out her, Bishop Lainie's Candle Ministry on Facebook. Remember?
Hi, Lainey. She's back.
Oh,
My apologies.
It's
I got disconnected.
we're just wrapping up. So,
just
any
as
final
Okay,
thoughts?
great.
So it was great having you
Yeah.
on.
Yes, thank you very much. You've been a wonderful guest.
All right. Well, it was great time, and thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate
We
it.
will invite you on again in the future, most certainly.
I'd love that.
Wonderful. So, ladies and gentlemen, that'll do it for tonight. We will be back next week, 6:30 to 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. We don't know if we're having a guest or what the topic will be. If nothing else, we do have there's some stuff about Easter I want to go into and the whole Easter Ishtar thing.
I think
Has
that'd
it
be
been
cool.
completely debunked?
Yeah, but it comes. I see it on my Facebook every single year, so I feel the need to address the ridiculousness of it.
Well, and also just the whole topic, the
Yeah.
history of it, all the things connected.
The
I think it's a worthwhile
Pagan
topic.
connections. It is interesting just because there are pagan aspects of Easter, there are Christian aspects of Easter, and there are some things that the pagans may actually have gotten from the early Christians.
Where did the resurrection of Jesus turn into bunnies and eggs? This is an important
Which is
topic.
actually is a really
Because
interesting.
conversion,
good story.
fornication. There you go.
But that's going to do it for tonight. Remember to check us out on Facebook and on YouTube, please. The Paranormal Encyclopedia. Like, comment, share, subscribe. If you have a little money to throw around and you don't know what else to do with it, www.patreon.com/demonology, patreon.com/demonology. We can use the support. But that's going to do it for me. This is Kevin Mears, and
Brian McKinley. You can check out all my stuff on Amazon.com or BrianMcKinleyAuthor.com.
okay, have a good night, everyone, and
Night.
God bless.
Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.
Excellent. And And yes, I was right. You made an excellent guest.
Yes.